I would argue that the progressive takeover of academia, you've got to go back over a century. You've got to go all the way back to the 1880s and 90s, believe it or not, to trace the origins of this. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that in the 1880s and 90s, most universities didn't do PhD programs.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 231. I'm talking to CJ Killmer. He has the Dangerous History podcast. He talks a lot about American history, and of course, he's also got the archetypical podcast. You said
Archetypical.
Yep. Archetypical podcast. Yes, we're going to talk about a little bit about American history. Also, CJ's in Florida, so I at least want to start out. How are things going right now in Florida, CJ? You've had those two hurricanes.
Yeah, well, in my part of the state, things are not so bad. Each of the two hurricanes, they kind of, made life go on pause for 5, 6, 7 days each. We lost power in some areas for a while and internet for a while, but it wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
Over on the Gulf Coast, on the other side of the state, for me, in some areas they got hit a lot worse. So,
Okay, so you're on the East Coast, so that's
yeah.
Okay, that's good. Well, anyway, so yeah, Dangerous History podcast. I always like to ask, how did you get into all this? How did you get started with that? How did you get into libertarian politics?
Yeah, I'll try to give the streamlined version. So I got interested in history pretty early on. Like by the time I was in high school, I was just interested in history and I was reading a lot of history books that no one was assigning me to read just out of curiosity. And so, when I got to the point of graduating from high school and then, thinking about college or whatever, I kind of decided to go. I just sort of like went along with the propaganda and the path of least resistance, which is, hey, when you finish high school, you go to college. And so I was like, okay, I don't really know what I want to do. And I picked history because I was like, well, I'm kind of interested in history. So let's go ahead and do that. And I got a bachelor's and master's degrees in history. Did not go on to a PhD for a variety of reasons. But then I taught college history for 16 years in total. And I always had kind of like an instinctive libertarian leaning, for lack of a better term. And the more I learned about history, especially when I went off the beaten path and, started doing my own self-directed research and things like that, I started to realize that so much of the conventional version of history that's in academia and that's also in much of like the sort of pop history books and things that you see out there um, is propagandistic. It's a narrative that supports a particular worldview and seeks to legitimize certain systems and institutions and things. And once I started to realize that, I got very interested in like digging up like the real truth. And so, some of the earliest places where I really got into it would be things like in regard to certain American wars, finding out how much of America's wars have been based on lies and things like that. And then also things like the American education system, encountering people like John Taylor Gatto and his work on that, and what our school system is really all about. And then, I really started to get even more interested into libertarian revisionism of history, for lack of a better term, around the time period of 2008, with the first Ron Paul campaign and the economic collapse and all that sort of stuff. I just got intensely curious of like, what else, in terms of my view of history, do I not have the full picture of? And so in 2014, I started my show, the Dangerous History Podcast, initially as just sort of like a hobby and an experiment to see, hey, could I do a history podcast that actually people would want to listen to? And then it just gradually grew over time. And in 2022, I left academia. I was very disillusioned by it for a while, but a lot of the stuff that came along with the COVID era just accelerated bad trends that were already bothering me. working in academia. And so by 2022, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I stepped away, and I've been doing a variety of other things since, still doing the Dangerous History podcast, obviously. Had some different jobs and things too to help make ends meet. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I am a renegade ex academic, is what I am.
Yeah. I think that's funny. I don't know if people ever reach that point. I remember asking myself, what would it be like if I read about World War II in a German history book, or
Yeah.
obviously, and believe it or not, I had a wonderful high school history teacher who actually once said, there are some people out there who think that Roosevelt let Pearl Harbor happen on purpose, and once you once you have something suggested to you like that, it kind of opens up everything. And
Yeah.
there's this realization now that all history books are written basically to justify the current status quo at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been a function of sort of official history since ancient times. So, you could go back to like the earliest quote unquote historians in terms of people who like that was their main job was, writing down information from the past or whatever. The earliest historians, they're all court historians. They're all, guys who worked for the king or the pharaoh or whatever, and they're in charge of writing down the history of, his king, his rule, maybe of his entire dynasty. And so, yeah, if, the pharaoh is giving you a nice, comfortable life in return for writing down the history of his rule, like, yeah, you don't even need to be told by the pharaoh, like, write good stuff or else, like, you
Yeah,
kind of know. And so, the last thing you're going to do is tell the truth if the truth involves, a lot of negative things about the pharaoh and his regime. And so instead you write about, oh yes, he's a living god, and he won this battle and won that battle, and his rule is so just, and the people have prospered under him. And, whether or not this is actually in line with objective reality, it's the official story. And so, the idea of revisionist history, a lot of times, people with a very kind of simplistic view of what history is will go, oh, revisionist history is just rewriting the past and blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, all revisionism really means in history is that you're taking a look at the existing sort of dominant narrative paradigm, and you're picking it apart and doing a critical analysis and saying, okay,
yeah,
the kind of generally accepted consensus on how we should think about, fill in the blank with any controversial historical question, World War II, um, you know, it it has problems. There are aspects of it that do not line up with the information we have, as far as primary sources and facts and whatever. And why is that? And then you start to realize that it's not just that the official version is like an error. It's that no, the official version was crafted as a load bearing fiction to, as you were saying a moment ago, to support largely the status quo. So, whatever institutions and individuals and, you know, government agencies and corporations and whatever else has power right now, they're going to tend to exert influence over how history is written. Because as Orwell put it very brilliantly, what's the quote? Something along the lines of, um, those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. So, in other words, the people and institutions that have power right now, they are able to control sort of the dominant narratives of history as people understand it, because they control everything from the publishing to information and news media companies to like literally textbook companies, academic institutions, professional academic associations. Like all these things are controlled by forces of what I would call the establishment. And so, yeah, the history we get is going to tend to support whoever and whatever the establishment is right now as being like a good inevitable thing, that, it's inevitable that the people in charge now are in charge, and it's a good thing. And they'll often write a history that's teleological, meaning it's written as if like history has a defined endpoint that it's marching towards, an end of history, if you will. And so, in the case of American academia, it's largely been a progressive, kind of teleology of we are evolving on this trajectory towards this endpoint, which is what Woodrow Wilson called modern democracy. But it's
Yes.
basically what we have, and what certain people want to give us more of, where there's this um, big bureaucratic administrative state with really no serious checks and balances or oversight or anything like that. They can just sort of, run things. And yeah, you get to have a vote every few years about, who gets to be the president or who your congressman is. But most of the time that's, you're choosing between two carefully pre-screened alternatives. And even if you do vote for, one candidate who's like maybe more anti-establishment, more against the status quo. And even if he does actually deliver on those, on that campaign rhetoric to oppose the establishment and change the status quo, and a lot of times they don't. A lot of times, obviously, once they get in, they just buckle and go along to get along anyway. But even if they do make an attempt, it's like, you know, what is one senator, one congressman, even a president able to really do in the face of such a powerful, what we would call deep state, right? Of these, super powerful people and agencies who are insulated from elections. Like, even if Trump wins in a landslide next week, the vast majority of the people who still comprise things like the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, and dozens of other agencies and institutions, they're going to be largely the same people that were there, under the previous 5 administrations. And yeah, Trump can replace a couple of people at the top of these things, but that doesn't change things as much as you might expect. And if you've ever worked in or dealt with like a large bureaucratic organization, you can understand why. Like, it's very easy for some new guy to come in as the head of some big bureaucratic organization and go, "All right, I'm going to shake things up and do dramatic changes, and we're going to cut this and we're going to change that and whatever." And it's amazing how often all of those ambitions just, founder on the rocks of bureaucratic intransigence and resistance to change or reform.
Yes, it does. Certainly, it's always interesting when you look at people who go into becoming school teachers, and so many of them quit in the first 5 years because they finally see it from the inside. They realize I can't fix this, and
Mhm.
then they go do something else. Uh, that's what I really wanted to talk about. That really fascinates me is the entire establishment with academia. It's you actually spent you were actually in academia for a while, which was probably difficult enough, for being a white guy. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the wokeism wasn't as bad when I started off, but yeah, definitely. Um, there were like jobs that I applied for when I was in academia that I didn't get, that like I'm pretty sure was just, I wasn't diverse enough. Yeah.
Yeah, you weren't diverse enough, but this is the question that's been nagging me for a long time is what happened to academia, and where did America go wrong with this? It seems, and and not just America, really. It seems like these ideas are everywhere in the colleges. They're certainly dominant in South America. The only places where they don't seem to dominate is in the former communist countries, and I suppose that's maybe because having it shoved down their throats kind of inoculated them against it. But otherwise,
Mhm.
these are the dominant ideas at Harvard, at Oxford, or wherever. What happened here? It's I've been wanting to know for a long time.
Yeah, so the roots of the progressive kind of monolithic dominance hegemony of academia, they go back way further than most people realize. I mean, some like very blue-pilled conservatives think that this just happened in the last like 10 or 20 years. They're like, holy cow, all of a sudden
Yeah.
academia became like a bunch of left-wingers.
Well,
Um,
one thing for sure, I can remember a lot of books and quite a few books in the late '80s and early '90s calling this out.
yep.
Thomas Sowell wrote Inside American Education. There was that good book by Martin Anderson called Imposters in the Temple. The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. Uh, Yeah, yeah, there were quite a and it's funny that all kinda happened at the same time. Yeah, yeah, I think it goes much back further further much further back than that. Yeah, please go on into that. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So sometimes certain like institutions um are liable to capture, where if enough people come into positions of authority in that institution that have the same ideology and that wish to use that institution for, propagating their ideology, you can get into a situation where it's like they just become entrenched. And because of the way academia works, it's kind of like a guild system, really. And so, like, if you're going through a PhD program, really what it amounts to is like a handful of professors that are your dissertation advisors, your dissertation committee. It's kind of in their hands to decide whether or not, the work you've done meets the requirements to get a PhD or an MA or whatever degree you're in. And so, without anyone even making a conscious effort to conspire or anything like that, it doesn't even really require that. But if over 90%, let's say, of the PhD credentialed professors in history in America, if over 90% of them are staunch, hardcore progressives, then
Yeah,
there's gonna be a certain amount of ideological expectations of conformity that is just unspoken, that the professors in question may never even consciously, like, think, like, "I'm only gonna try and, accept, graduate students that believe what I believe." Like, they're not really thinking that consciously, because they're sort of like the fish that has lived its entire life in water and doesn't know what water is, because they've never experienced anything else to contrast it with. So most academics have been in like an ideological bubble since they were 18, possibly longer, if they came from like a
yeah,
left-wing blue area and a left-wing family. And so in that sort of mindset, it's like, yeah, without ever consciously deciding to, you're more likely to think better of people who share your worldview, and you're more likely to want to, give degrees, take on graduate students, and hire new faculty if they share your worldview. I mean, I can have all the credentials in the world as a history professor, and if I walk into a job committee and I just have like a little tiny unobtrusive button on my collar that says "Make America Great Again," like, it doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter how fancy my degrees are, how much experience I have, how otherwise, charming of a guy I might be. Hell, I might even be diverse. But if I've got like anything that signifies that I'm not part of the ideological monolith, then even if it's subconsciously, the members, let's say it's a committee of professors who are hiring a new professor to join their department, they're gonna just tend to naturally prefer people who clearly exhibit, that they share the same worldview as the entire rest of the department. So, yeah, it's one of those situations where it's like once progressivism got entrenched because of the nature of academia as a kind of guild system, once any ideology got in there overwhelmingly dominant, it would tend to just sort of stay there over generations.
yeah,
So, as to why progressivism in particular took over American academia, some conservatives who are like partially red pilled will think this happened in the 60s. That's like as far back as they'll go. But no, no, no. It actually, I would argue that the progressive takeover of academia, you've got to go back over a century. You've got to go all the way back to the 1880s and 90s, believe it or not, to trace the origins of this. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that in the 1880s and 90s, most universities didn't do PhD programs. It was a relatively new and rare thing still. And most of the universities that did have PhD programs, they were in continental Europe, especially in Germany and to a lesser extent in France and some other countries in continental Europe. And so if let's say you were an American and you got your bachelor's degree in history from some university, but you really wanted to get a PhD because that's the hip new thing. And this also, by the way, coincides with the professionalization of academic disciplines, where there started to be more like structured requirements to be considered a quote unquote legitimate credentialed historian. There's now expectations of certain degrees and certain practices and things like that. Not all of which are negative. I mean, I think it's a good idea that we have like basic standards that we're supposed to follow for research, basic, formats that we should follow for footnote. Like there's a lot of nuts and bolts things that it makes sense that you would kind of have, some sort of an agreement on basic practice, best practices and things like this. But so if you were an American in like 1885 and you wanted to get a PhD degree in history or economics or something like this, there were very few American universities that even had such a program at the time. Probably you're going to Germany. And if you're going to a German university in the late 19th century, and doing anything of what today we would consider the social sciences, history, political science, economics, even things like philosophy, bleeding off into the humanities. Well, in Germany of that time period, all the universities were chock full of this kind of German historicist view on history and philosophy and everything like this, and comes from the thinking and writing of people like George Hegel is probably the biggest leading light, but there were others as well. And these German intellectuals, they had this very teleological idea about history and social sciences. They had an early version of technocracy, this idea that society would be better off if experts that were largely insulated from democratic elections were able to just sort of like run most of the government. And yeah, you can have an elected parliament over here off to one side, but they don't really run things. Instead, there's this permanent administrative state, and that this is progress, and that this is what ultimately all societies are going to be evolving toward over the long scope of history. Some are just current at the moment, more advanced than others along that path, but that ultimately every society is going to evolve along this path towards a powerful administrative state and expert technocratic control of the economy and other sectors of life. And so if you went and got a PhD at a German university, this is just going to be like baked into the economics courses you're taking or the history courses you're taking. It's not like it's going to be artificially grafted on. It's going to be organically embedded in the curriculum. And so odds are, after you spend 4, 5, 6 years at a German university doing that and learning from professors who have like this view of the social sciences, well, you're going to come back to America and bring those ideas with you. And the reality is that to a large extent, American progressivism is just, rebranded, kind of Americanized in terms of the jargon around it, but it's sort of just rebranded Hegelianism and German historicism blended in with American pietistic Christianity of the time period,
Yeah.
the kind of Third Great Awakening era. Um, and so this means that and a lot of those same people that are coming back from Europe with these PhD degrees they got in places like Germany, who have now been indoctrinated into this, very pro big powerful government kind of worldview about their discipline. They now come in, and because they've got wow, you've got a PhD from the University of Heidelberg. Wow, we're definitely going to hire you to be our next, Harvard history professor instead of some guy that has just I don't know if they had a master's degree back then yet or not. I forget when that came in, but a guy got a master's degree from like University of such and such in America. This guy's got a PhD from one of the most respected universities in Europe. We're going to hire that second guy, right? And so this also, like I said, coincides with the professionalization of academic disciplines. And so you also get at the same time that the faculties of American universities are getting stuffed full of people who either themselves got a PhD in Europe or who were taught by people who did. Like a good example of the latter is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson didn't get any degrees overseas, but he got his PhD degree at Johns Hopkins University, which was a university modeled on German style universities in its founding. And most of his professors that he had, his main professors at Johns Hopkins, had gotten PhD degrees in Germany. And so Wilson is getting German historicism secondhand as well at Johns Hopkins. So, these are the guys who are then going to be like, not just the professors, but, like, the elites, the guy like Woodrow Wilson, who's eventually gonna be the president of Princeton University for, like, a decade.
Yes.
Um, and then these same people are also, the same people who are gonna be the ringleaders in creating the professional academic associations. So you look back and you see like 1890s, early 1900s roughly is when most of the major academic professional associations get founded. So I'm talking here about things like the American Historical Association, the American Economics Association, the American
Yeah.
Political Science Association, and so on and so forth. And these still are to this day like dominant professional organizations that if you're an American history professor at a significant university and you're not a member of the AHA, like, you're people are gonna look at you funny. It's not quite like a union where you could lose your job for not being a member, but, like, next time you're up for tenure review or something like that, they're gonna ask you, like, "So what professional associations do you belong to?" And when you look into the founding of the professional academic associations, they're all founded by like hardcore outspoken progressives. And you can find quotes from them saying this. And so, the guys that founded most of the guys that founded the American Economics Association were not like traditional, even Adam Smithian, laissez faire, free market ish types. They were like hardcore, explicitly, saying things like laissez-faire is bad. And so, these profession and these are the associations that often are the ones that, publish the major academic journals. They're the ones that put on the major academic conferences, and publishing in journals and presenting at conferences is how you know, make your career go up if you're an academic.
Yes.
Um,
Publish or perish. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And so if just to get into a graduate history, let's say, is that example, my discipline, just to get into a history graduate level program, you're going to have an easier time of it if you're some sort of progressive. Getting along with your whoever your committee is, they're probably going to be most, if not all, hardcore progressives. Getting along with them and pursuing it through to the degree is going to be a lot easier if you share their worldview. And then, getting a job once you have your degree, getting a job at a university is going to be a lot easier if you have the same ideology everybody else already does. And then, yeah, getting published and getting your paper accepted at conferences, all things that are feathers in your cap that help you keep your job and get promoted if you're a professor. All of these things are controlled by individuals and institutions that have a very, very strong ideological bias. And it's not even like, again, it's not even like they're sitting around going, all right, we're all progressives, right? Okay. And we all agree that we're only going to, accept progressive papers to publish. Yes. It's not like that at all. It's so baked into these people's bones that they don't have to like say this to each other or say this to themselves. It's sort of like how most of the mainstream media, quote unquote, news reporters, they don't have to be told, hey, don't report on, this story over here that makes the US military industrial complex look bad. Or, hey, don't report on this story over here that makes big pharma look bad. It's like most people that are high up in the mainstream news apparatus, they don't have to be told. They're already so like in that worldview that it's just what they're going to naturally do. And so that's really what happened. Now, I would say by about 1900, progressive dominance of most academic disciplines was pretty much locked down and has remained ever since. It's gotten maybe even a little bit more overwhelming in recent years. And what exactly progressivism is has changed and evolved over the years as well. So, I talk about progressivism going through different versions. In the Woodrow Wilson version, I would call progressivism version 1.0. It's clearly the ancestor of today's progressivism, but it's also not the same thing. There's been, changes made to it over the years of what it means to be a progressive. Obviously in Woodrow Wilson's day, there was nothing like the woke craziness that's now part of progressivism in our era. But, once you have the progressives dominating academia, it means that as what it means to be a progressive changes and evolves over, a century plus, that's simply reflected in academia. So, now that progressivism no longer means like I'm a New Deal Democrat, now that progressivism means like I'm a crazy woke person, well, then that's, what you're going to see reflected more and more in academia. It reflects whatever is the dominant version of progressivism for that time period. So super long-winded answer, but obviously this is a topic I've done a fair amount of research and thinking on because yeah, I wanted to understand it as well. Like, how did this happen? Is there, a good explanation as to why is it? And also, I think I throw in there too. Once it becomes kind of obvious that academia is, progressive dominated, then that also creates a self-selection mechanism, where let's say I'm a bright young guy who's interested in history and really wants to teach and write about history, but I'm conservative or I'm libertarian. Well, I'm probably going to just not ever go into academic history because I'm just going to be like, yeah. Now, in my own case as an individual, I did the opposite. I did something. I was like, you know what? Yeah, they're all a bunch of progressives, but I'm going to go there because I'll be, one of the fringe weirdos that's like, a dissident within academia. That's what I did. But the vast majority of people, if you're an intelligent, articulate, guy, and you're like, oh man, it'd be really cool to be a history professor. Yeah, but you're right wing or something. You're going to just go, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to, and if you're a white male these days, it's even worse because now it's like, oh, not only am I going to be an ideological pariah within my profession, but I'm already going to be, kind of not not being looked at favorably default just because I'm a straight white male. So basically, if I don't constantly flog myself for my original sin, um, I'm suspect anyway in the eyes of 90% of my colleagues.
Yeah, that's yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. A few things to comment on here. I believe it was also during this progressive era that we got a lot of what I would call professional organizations that were formed. I mean, things
Yep.
like the American Medical Association, was it was maybe more too. And I know you hear back in the days of Lincoln that you could actually go and read law, and that we got to this where these higher level professions started to require you to have this magical college degree that maybe before you the value was just on going out and getting apprenticeships or getting
Yep.
experience. Secondly, as you've talked about Germany, uh, I don't think it's an accident that that Germany went where it did in the 1930s. When you look at all of this, I think, I mean, isn't there really a connection to this? I mean, between this Hegelianism and eventually, the Third Reich.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely connections, just in the sense of that. I think it had been just kind of like inculcated into the German mind, for lack of a better term, and partly this has to do with the fact that it was Prussia that unified Germany rather than potentially one of the other German states that did it, and so
Yes.
Prussia was the most militarized of the independent German states
Yeah.
before German unification, and just sort of like default was kind of like an authoritarian
Yeah.
sort of regime. Not that the king of Prussia or later the emperor of Germany, not that he was a dictator in the sense of like a North Korean dictator or something like that, in our time, but just this general idea that you're a good citizen if you obey the government. You're a good citizen if you believe the government. You're a good citizen if you comply with what the technocrats who are running the bureaucracies want you to do. I think the German people, like the intellectuals, imbibed these ideas again, like with the idea of court historians, because what kind of political scientist or historian or economist is the Kaiser's regime likely to bestow, favor on? It's going to be the guy that's like, what's great? Having an all-powerful government that, puts experts in charge of fixing society and fixing the economy, and that's progress. Those are the guys that, the German government is going to give like good professor jobs to, and things like this. Um, and then the average German person, I think just got sort of trained to be obedient and compliant, and a lot of that goes back to the genius of the Prussian education system. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there are some societies that are just sort of like preconditioned better than others for accepting more authoritarianism, and I think, yeah, that, a lot of great things you can say about the German people. I'm part German myself,
Same
but
here.
they have that sort of like, almost sort of engineering mindset as a people in a lot of ways, which, makes them really cool at building neat cars or, building cool technology and whatever. But at the same time, it also comes with this, I think, just sort of attitude of being, I would say, too eager to just accept, a paternalistic administrative state, controlling huge aspects of society. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be, going off the rails into Nazism, but it creates the opportunity. It creates like fertile grounds for once a virulent ideology gets in place, it's sort of got like a turnkey, administrative apparatus to
Yeah.
become authoritarian.
Well, I remember Stephen Hicks pointed out, that like 1920s Germany was the most quote educated unquote society in the history of the world at the time, and just and said, what did they do with that? And Wilson himself is the only PhD president that America's had, and
Yep.
ended up being a disaster. I know Rothbard wrote about the combination of pietism because progressive 1.0, it included some things that they would never admit to including right now, and obviously they wanted to get women to vote. We have that, and but they were also somewhat eugenicist, and also almost all of them wanted to outlaw that evil thing called alcohol, shut down the saloons, and
Mhm.
boy, they've certainly erased that from history.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the constants, I would say, in all the different variations or versions of progressivism that we've had, um, one of the constants that you can see running like a thread connecting all of them is this kind of elitist paternalism. And, this is not the same thing as patriarchy. A lot of times
Yeah,
people hear the word, paternalism, they think I'm talking about like, a as like an anti-feminist thing or whatever.
yeah,
It's like, no, no, no. Paternalism really just means the idea that somebody should be like your big brother kind of nanny, that
yeah,
that the government should be that. And so it shouldn't just like try to protect you from, murderers and rapists and thieves and whatever, but it should also try to protect you from your own vices and from yourself. And so, yeah, progressives, there wasn't a 100% overlap on the Venn diagram of progressives and, alcohol prohibitionists in the early 20th century. It wasn't 100%, but man, there was a lot of overlap. Like, there were people who were prohibitionists and not progressives, and people who were progressive and not prohibitionists, but the number of people who were progressive and prohibitionist was quite huge. And yeah, it's the same, worldview that's behind the war on drugs. It's the same worldview that's
yes,
behind, censoring people in the name of safety and protecting you from dis and malinformation. It's the same thing that's behind, all kinds of stuff, laws against gambling, number of other things we could think of where the government, it's the nanny state impulse. Um, and that's one of the things, or even just the view that, we can't just let the economy run itself. We have to have experts who are like over, the various business owners and things like this. We've got to have, people with PhDs in economics and things who are going to manage the economy from above. Like they're even above the actual heads of the corporations, and they're going to tell them what to do and regulate them in the name of the common good, of course. So, yeah, this paternalistic, idea of how the government should operate. Yeah, if you actually went and asked people in the 1900s, like, do you want us, regular people, not elite intellectuals and politicians, go to regular people in working class neighborhoods in like 1910 and ask them, like, do you want us to ban your alcohol? You're not going to get a lot of yeses, but still, progressive leaders will, in the name of democracy, push for alcohol prohibition and figure out how to get it passed, even though a lot of people really didn't want it. Um, and so they've always had this view of democracy, which is really kind of, I don't know, in some ways it traces back to Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I think. Um, this idea that democracy, uh, good democracy is not the people just pick what they want and then get what they asked for. That good democracy is enlightened elites who, more than regular people, can see the truth and see which way history is going and who can reflect the general will and the common good. They're going to decide what's in the best interests of the common people and do that. Whether the common people ever actually asked for that or not, doesn't matter. What the truly democratic thing to do in this worldview is to do what you think is best. Like, you're the affluent person with a PhD degree. You should be making the decisions because you know better than the working class guy what is in his own best interest. And yeah, he doesn't want you to ban his liquor, but you know what's best for him is that you ban his liquor. And you can apply that to lots and lots of issues. Um, but yeah, this overall kind of paternalist mindset when applied to government and politics.
Well, yeah, this reminds me of that fairly famous quote from, the historian Carol Quigley. Quote, "The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies is a foolish idea. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound change or extensive shifts in policy. Then it should be possible to replace it every 4 years if necessary by the other party, which will be none of these things, but will still pursue with new vigor approximately the same basic policies." Unquote.
Yeah, yeah, and I've thought, the thought has occurred to me when thinking about the Soviet Union that the Soviet government made a mistake by being a one-party system. Because if you have an actual one-party system and the system is working very badly and like huge majorities of people are extremely discontented with it, and there's only been one political party allowed to even exist in a country for decades on end, well, then everybody knows who to blame. And it's more likely like everyone will start to coalesce around, F the Communist Party in that case, right? And
Yeah.
I've often thought that the communist government of the Soviet Union would have been much smarter had they early on developed and allowed and even kind of fostered and nurtured a two-party system. Instead of trying to wipe out the Trotskyists, for example, under Stalin, they
Yes.
should have just allowed there to be two communist parties, just like our, main parties, where the differences between them are actually not that great when you zoom out
Yes.
and look at it from the big picture. And they could have had like, blue Trotskyist Communist Party versus the red Stalinist Communist Party, and they could like go crazy arguing viciously against each other like, "Oh, comrade, you only want to devote this percentage of the central plan for this year to, roads, and I wanted to devote this bigger percentage, and you want to spend it all on Sputnik and I want to spend a little bit more on nukes," or and like just come up with BS arguments over petty differences and let your leaders like just go nuts calling each other every name in the book about that, and then allow those two, you know, different flavors of Communist Party to just play, musical chairs every few years. Oh, good, we got tired of those Stalinists were running the economy into the ground. Great, we brought in the Trotskyists. Now they're going to make the Soviet Union great again. Um, that would have been a brilliant move if the Soviets did that. The British and Americans kind of stumbled into that just because of the way our election laws are with first past the post voting and things like this that tend to naturally create a two-party system most of the time in the British and American systems. Um, and so from the point of view of our oligarchs who want to allow you the illusion of choice without having to risk the potential that anything fundamental will actually be changed by elections, it was a stroke of good luck. But yeah, by the time you get into to last century, I should say, smarter people like Quigley, and the smarter oligarchs too, they kind of understood this, and they
Yeah.
realized like it's actually a good thing for the long term stability of our rule if we allow there to be, you know, two controlled teams. It's this whole idea of controlled opposition. Um, and one of the things that's been very interesting in recent years is uh, it seems like the role of the Republican Party, as designated by the establishment since the 1930s, has been supposed to be controlled opposition. They're supposed to be, the Democrats have been supposed to be the dominant party of the establishment since at least the 1930s.
Yeah.
But they want to let the Republicans still win every now and
Yeah.
then to maintain this illusion of democracy and this
Mhm.
illusion of choice. Meanwhile, the vast majority of what the state is and what the state does just kind of keeps going in the direction it's going, regardless who wins elections.
Yeah, of course, you did have that brief period, where Theodore Roosevelt was in was red, and yeah, it definitely, and it definitely changed for the blue team. I guess really the most profound change was when Cleveland went out, and then they nominated William Jennings Bryan, who may not have been, I don't know how progressive he was, but that was a profound change. And of course, ran three times and lost, but talked
Yeah,
about the cross of gold speech, and of course later, most famous toward the end of his life, he also was coming out in favor of religious fundamentalism and against Darwin's theory.
yeah, he's an interesting character. I kind of
Very
have a
interesting character. Yes.
Yeah, I have a little bit of affection for him just because he was mostly very good on issues of war and peace. So I'll give him his due on that. He was like the lone voice of sanity in regard to foreign policy during the first couple years of
Yes.
Woodrow Wilson's presidency.
Yeah.
So I'll give him credit on that. And he was really more of a populist than a progressive.
Yeah.
And there's overlap on specific issues between the
Yeah.
populists and the progressives where like at the time both of them were in favor of the income tax, both of them were in favor of what's the amendment that made the US senators directly elected? Is it the 17th amendment, I think?
Maybe that is the 17th. Yeah. It's
Yeah, whichever one made senators
yeah.
directly popularly elected, like both populists and progressives overlapped in favor
Yeah,
of
and,
that.
and they also
Um,
push things like initiative referendums, recalls, stuff like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But to me, the difference between populists and progressives, and populists, tended to be better on foreign policy questions than progressives for sure. But really, what the difference comes down to is that the populists believed in democracy the way most people mean and understand the term
Yes.
democracy. The populist view is like, oh, what does the majority of our voters want us to do as far as policy goes? All right, let's figure that out and try and deliver that to them. So it's like the kind of like standard idea of what democracy is supposed to mean and how it's supposed to work. Whereas the progressives had this, like I was saying a minute ago, this elitist paternalist attitude, which is like, yeah, we want there to be elections, but we want to have a huge amount of what the government actually is and does insulated and firewalled off from elections. And at the end of the day, we believe that the truly democratic thing to do, again, is not to do what the common man is asking you to do for him, but rather to do what as an enlightened elite with a advanced degree from Johns Hopkins University is best for the common man, even if it's in opposition to what the common man is actually asking you for.
Yeah, because occasionally, the populace will scream, for things that are, they scream about injustices that at least some cases are legitimate injustices.
Yeah,
I mean, I had a great uncle who died in a coal mining accident. Things like the horrible fire, at the Triangle factory in the when was that, the teens. I mean, they were complaining about things that were legitimate things to complain about.
yeah,
Working conditions. They wanted, you know, I think they might have just achieved that more just through going striking than necessarily going through legislation. But and a lot of these and a lot of these injustices too were also created by corporate welfare.
sure.
All of the corruption of the railroads was created by corporate welfare. And sometimes I think populism is just a natural response that said, look, you're giving away all this money to the rich people. Why don't you give money away to the poor people too?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
well, the way that I've come to understand populism just in general, not even speaking
yeah,
specifically about, the populism of William Jennings Bryan's era, but that as well as, more recent um populist movements and things, including the MAGA Trump, kind of movement, but also things in between, like some of the like Huey Long stuff in the 30s,
Yeah.
or some other things that happened in the 60s, for example, is that what I think populism really is a genuine democratic impulse of common people asserting itself in the face of a scam democracy. So I
Yeah.
would argue that the American system is oligarchy masquerading as a democratic republic. Like functionally, it's oligarchy. Um, but that, the common people, especially, they are taught from, fifth grade or seventh grade or whatever, if not earlier, they are taught that we live in this representative democratic republic and that your leaders are supposed to listen to you and, take your wishes seriously and into account when making policy decisions. And so that's the fiction. Now it is a fiction. The reality is, much more of like a corrupt oligarchy where, politicians do whatever's in the interests of their donors. That's what it really is. But because common people have been inculcated with and to some extent believe the idea that this is supposed to be a democracy, they may not have the like political science education to articulate it the way I'm doing now, where I'm saying, you're telling us this is the democracy, but I can tell it's an oligarchy. Like they may not be able to articulate that clearly, but they have this like gut level feeling of like something's wrong. The money changers are in charge of the temple, right? And so you get these movements, these impulses that we call populism, which to me, populism is like, in a moral sense, neutral. Like whether populism is good or bad largely depends on what is it specifically trying to do and how is it trying to do it. It can go off the rails. Populism can go off the rails into some dark places for sure. But at the same time, it can also, do some good as just like a method of pushing back against an oligarchic establishment that is just, behaving in a completely authoritarian manner.
Yeah.
And, when the oligarchy feels like they have to at least put up a good pretense of democracy, they tend to behave a little bit better, not because they genuinely believe in it or because they're trying to be nice, but just because they realize like, oh, we can only have the fiction, like we can only contradict the narrative fiction of the system so much before
Yeah.
even the uneducated might start to wake up and realize what the matrix is, so to speak. Um, but where we're at now, it's like the American oligarchy of today is so arrogant and so corrupt
Yeah.
that they're not even bothering with the pretense anymore.
Yeah.
Like when you have multiple top members of the Democratic Party, for example, like we all know they would love to have censorship and they would love it if the First Amendment didn't exist.
Yeah.
But in previous eras, they would have never said anything along those lines out loud in public. They might have said it in closed doors, they might have
Yeah.
thought it, but the fact that you've got now, I mean, it's almost everybody. It's like, Barack Obama, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, like on and on and on. Some of the biggest people in the Democratic Party still, um, openly, publicly saying stuff like the First Amendment is a problem that we need to fix. And oh, this is horrible that,
Yeah.
oh, wouldn't it be better if we were more like a lot of, these European countries or something where there's really not anything like a First Amendment and the government can just, censor whatever the hell it wants. Um, and the fact that the American oligarchs and their political sock puppets are openly saying that they want to be authoritarian
Yeah.
shows that like they are just so, they're not even acting in, they're so arrogant they're now going to sabotage their own interests, because if they were more wise and prudent they would realize like, oh, we need to back off on certain things right now because otherwise we're going to wake up a sleeping giant.
Yeah.
um but they're so arrogant and corrupt they're not even thinking that way. They're thinking short term, if they're thinking at all.
Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention with in the early days, where did the imperialism exactly come from? Because I really think that libertarians greatly underestimate just how evil McKinley was
Mhm.
with regard to imperialism. the annexation of Hawaii, and of course, the war against, the war to liberate, Cuba.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in regard to like that version
Of course,
of American imperialism.
Roosevelt continued that too after McKinley got shot.
Yeah, and TR was even more of a driving force behind it than McKinley was. McKinley is a complicated character because it really does seem to me like after having done a fair amount of research and reading on McKinley and the Spanish American War and the Philippines War and everything like that, I do believe
Yeah,
that McKinley was genuinely not a warmonger. Like I really do believe McKinley was not super eager to go to war in the way somebody like Teddy Roosevelt was.
yeah,
McKinley had actually um, seen a little bit of what the Civil War looked like. And he seems to have genuinely been like reluctant to go to war. But he had another competing value, which was he very much did believe in this sort of manifest destiny idea of American expansionism. And by the
yeah,
time McKinley's president, it's like, all right, Team America has already expanded sea to shining sea, and, we probably don't want to deal with the problem of conquering Mexico because even though we could do it, it's going to mean, having to incorporate tens of millions of people that at the time, Americans would have considered racially inferior. And, we can't take over Canada like we've been dreaming about for a long time because the British are just too strong. They'll keep us out. So, okay. And we've already gone all the way to the Pacific. So let's just keep. So in McKinley's case, I don't think he necessarily bought into like all of the progressive view
yeah,
of kind of imperialism. But it was more just like the older manifest destiny idea of just America expanding is a good thing. And so the next place to expand to is those islands in the Pacific. So he had these competing values. On the one hand, he wasn't a big warmonger just inherently. He was kind of reluctant to go to war, thought it should be a last resort, but he wanted America to expand. And so it's like, push comes to shove, which value is he going to come down on between those two competing things, right? Because it was at a point where America could no longer expand without causing wars, um, you know, with Spain or whoever else owns the territories that you're looking to take over. And meanwhile, you've got Teddy Roosevelt, who, was at the Navy Department and was scheming to, I now believe the USS Maine was actually a false flag that was
yeah,
largely run by Teddy Roosevelt through the Office of Naval Intelligence, which he was
yeah,
overseeing at the time as Assistant Navy Secretary.
yeah,
And the Teddy Roosevelt progressive imperialists, they were different. Roosevelt himself loved war, thought war was a good thing for its
yeah.
own sake. Wasn't a reluctant, war guy like McKinley was.
Yeah, and to his
Um,
credit, Roosevelt was actually willing to go into the trenches and do it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I always give him
He
credit
wasn't a
on that
laptop bombardier. Yeah,
for sure. I respect him for that. Um, but even the progressives who were not like TR in that they were like explicitly like, yeah, war is a
yeah,
good thing and it makes us manly and virtuous or whatever. Even the progressives that didn't speak that way and that spoke in a much more peacenicky kind of a way, they still had certain beliefs that meant that they were amenable to being propagandized into supporting a war. Like they might, a guy like John Dewey, for example, he might spend all day long saying how war is bad and it'd be great if we could not have it. But, along comes a war and it's not that hard to get him to sign up for it. Partly because you can tell John Dewey, hey, uh, if we have this war, all those big government programs you want to like have the government take over the economy and that you're not able to get passed politically right now. Hey, in wartime, guess what? We can do all that. We can cartelize the economy and have the government, regulate it more heavily, because all we got to do is say it's justified by the war. We need to have the
yes,
government take over the economy to win the war. So do that, you get all the votes you need to take over the economy.
yes,
And then you also, on top of that, can then tell, liberal progressive types who are kind of, not John McCain TR style, like militarist cheerleaders.
yeah,
You could also come up with a nice humanitarian cover story for each war that you want them to support, and you can convince a good majority of them to go along with it. So you can tell progressive reformers in America in like 1900, hey, I know you're not a big warmonger, but we're fighting this war in the Philippines. Unfortunately, We're there to help the Filipinos. We're trying to
Yes.
uplift and civilize them and spread the benefits of American democracy to the Filipinos. Unfortunately, because of their racial backwardness, a lot of them are too stupid to understand that we're there pointing guns and bayonets at them because we're trying to help them. They don't understand. They're going to fight us, and so unfortunately, we have to deal with that. We have to pacify that element of Filipino society so that the good Filipinos, which means collaborators, will go along with American rule of their country. And so you come up with a nice sounding fairy tale about we're not going to war because we want to dominate and exploit the Philippines. We're doing it because we want to liberate them. We want to uplift them and bring them the benefits of our civilization. And we're going to build hospitals and schools for them and bring them vaccines and whatever else. And then you can get, progressive peacenik sounding people, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them to support World War One.
Yes.
Because you come up with a good fairy tale and you say, well, us and enlightened countries like Britain and France, we're all about evolving towards modern democracy and freedom and all these sorts of things. And we're fighting against despotism of, Germany, the most authoritarian regime that's ever existed, which of course under the Kaiser is not at all true.
No.
Um,
No.
in
Yeah.
fact, the Kaiser's government was far less authoritarian than the Tsar's government, and yet the Tsar was an ally of Britain and France in World War
Yeah.
One.
I
So
can imagine that. Yeah. Germany was not this. At least in World War One, was not this horrible villain that they were made out to be.
yeah, no. I mean, their government, yeah, it was militaristic and imperialist and kind of authoritarian, but so was every other government that fought in World War One. Basically, I mean, especially the
Yeah.
original belligerent powers. It's like, oh yeah, and the British were not an aggressive expansionist empire at the
Yeah.
time? Really? The biggest empire in the world was not aggressively expansionist? How about they had already done most of their expanding, so they were able to just sit back and go,
Yeah.
expand imperial conquest is now bad. Now that I'm sitting on a quarter of the territory on planet Earth, I've decided that imperial expansionism is bad. So now Johnny come lately Germany that's trying to pick up a few leftover scraps of Africa and Asia or whatever, now they look like jerks because they're trying to do what we already did, over the past 200 years. They're trying to do it now, which makes them look bad. And
Yeah.
we're here to spread civilization and uplift people, unlike those mean, nasty Germans.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing the way Roosevelt convinced America to get involved in this war, which they really gained nothing from, and
Oh yeah,
really it ended up, will make the world safe for democracy, and really ended up, I think, setting the table and making a situation that ended up being a whole lot worse, and then still having repercussions for us today.
oh sure, I
Yeah,
definitely
but
agree
I
with
don't
that.
want to go that much into that detail, but talking about progressive 1.0, though, the populism progressive thing, I know at the time there was what was called the Wisconsin idea,
Yeah.
and it and it's not an accident. I don't necessarily think that Wisconsin was also considered very much a German state.
Mhm.
That you'd have this state university that would educate the public on, or propagandize the public on what's best for them, and so they would control everything. And that came out of that.
Mhm.
Well, and I got to admit, when I was a teenager, I was pretty sympathetic to La Follette. I mean, I've always found
Mhm.
him to be a very interesting character as well. Robert La Follette,
Yeah.
who was really the most well known progressive at the time, who was never elected president, but got electoral votes in 1924 as a progressive. And what can you tell us about La Follette a little bit? How much of an influence was he on all this? And La
He's a
Follette was totally opposed to the war, by the way.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. Of progressive politicians of the early 20th century, he's probably the one I like the best because he was really good on a lot of important issues of his time, especially during World War One, as you were mentioning. So another way that I kind of think about progressivism throughout the last 130-ish years of American history, I think of it in versions that it sort of evolves through over the generations, but also I think there's always been sort of like two levels of progressive too. And so there's the level that's always dominant, which I would call corporatist progressivism.
Yeah.
And these are the
Yes.
progressives who they may talk a lot about how they want to rein in big corporations and all this sort of stuff and,
Yeah.
stand up to the robber barons. But in reality, they're actually, when you look at how they're taking over the economy and cartelizing and regulating it, it's in the benefit of the oligarchs themselves, of the
And in
of the
some
big
cases,
corporations.
they're funded by this too, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. This is the
yeah,
sort of stuff that, new left historians like Gabriel Kolko started to expose in the mid 20th century, doing a revisionist take on progressivism 1.0, and then other people later like Rothbard kind of built on that. But this idea that, like, yeah, the Federal Reserve, just to take one example, the Federal Reserve wasn't something that Wall Street didn't want and that was forced on them by grassroots reformers. It's the other way around. It's that, Wall Street wanted a central bank to, help out their interests, and they knew that they couldn't get it done politically if they, had politicians trying to sell it to the American people, saying, "Hey, look, I just came from a meeting with J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan really wants there to be a new central bank." Like, that's not going to get a lot of votes to pass the bill, right? Whereas if instead J.P. Morgan and his partners can quietly funnel funds to fund, publications and academic conferences and kind of early proto think tanks, to say like, "Oh, gee whiz, we put all of our best progressive technocrats, all of these guys with economics PhDs, and we had them have a you know a they had a big meeting, they had a big convention, to come up with what should we do about our banking system, and by golly, they happened to come up with this proposal for a central bank, and happens to be in reality exactly what JP Morgan and his partners and all the other banksters wanted. And
yeah,
so that's the dominant version of progressivism, that actually tends to control policy. And that version of progressivism, what I call corporatist progressivism, has been the dominant version of progressivism all along, even as it's gone through several iterations over a century plus. And that strain of progressivism or level of progressivism, the corporate one, is also the one that tends to be very authoritarian,
yeah,
tends to be very bad on civil liberties, tends to take this paternalistic idea of government and want to apply it to things like censoring speech that might, rile people up, I should say. And the corporatist progressives have also always tended to be bad on wars and foreign policy. They're the ones that get America into World War One. They're the ones
yeah,
that get America into Vietnam and all these other things. But there's always been this like dissident, less powerful strain of progressivism operating alongside. And these are the ones who are like the progressives that'll actually be anti-war. Um, and not just, "Oh, I'm anti-war in the abstract sense, but I'm for this war." But like, no, anti-war means anti-war. So yeah, La Follette, would be an example of that, where he genuinely took a lot of heat during World War One, by speaking out against America getting in the war in the first place. He called out even the sinking of the Lusitania for what it was. He was one of the very few people who were pointing out, correctly, turns out, even though he was being called, a purveyor of malinformation or
yes,
disinformation at the time. But he correctly pointed out, as Wilson would have known at the time, that the Lusitania was, stuffed full of contraband of war when it was
yeah,
sunk, that it was jammed full of ammunition and stuff being sent to the British. And then La Follette was also, really good on, speaking out in favor of free speech and against all the
yeah,
censorship and criminalizing of political dissidents during World War One. And whether I would agree with all of his economic reforms, either that he did as governor of Wisconsin or that he would have wanted to do as president of the U.S. or whatever, whether I think all of his reforms might have been a good or a bad idea, setting that aside, someone like him, more of the reforms he wanted to do, the way he wanted to do them, were things that guys like JP Morgan would have not been on board with. And so to me, it's like when you look at that progressive dissident minority of that time period, the progressives who stayed opposed to World War One right up through the whole thing, who
yeah,
criticized Wilson, and defended free speech and all that sort of stuff during World War One. To me, those are like the early version of like today's, um, sort of like Jimmy Dore progressivism,
yeah,
where, they might want a government that does more in terms of like social welfare programs or whatever like that, but they're not in favor of censoring anyone who disagrees with them. They actually do, not just pay lip service, but do genuinely think democracy is a good idea, free speech is a good idea. They don't want to criminalize and prosecute their political opponents. And they tend to be more skeptical and hesitant, if not outright opposed to interventionist foreign policy. So like that version of progressivism that, is the version of progressivism I'm more sympathetic to, even though obviously I wouldn't agree with them on everything. But that's always been there, but it's always been like in a subservient position
Yeah,
without a whole lot of institutional power.
yeah, and this was also the time when the American Civil Liberties Union was formed.
Yep.
Was in that time. Also you mentioned John Dewey earlier, and I do consider him to be one of the great villains of our time because you know uh, uh, there was also a wonderful movement that started in around 19 in the 19 teens that was coming out of Italy was the movement for Montessori education, and they completely shut that movement down.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, she was doing Dr. Montessori was doing amazing things in Italy, and they just said no. This because where do you think how do you think that played a part in this? I mean, because one thing that was one of the first cases of the government getting into the college business, of course, were the normal schools as we called them back then. The
Mm-hmm.
teachers' colleges.
Yeah, well, I mean that's like a powerful, like, I'm trying to think of how to put it. Um if you can establish dominance over the education departments of
Mm.
colleges and universities throughout the country, and really you can do it gradually, incrementally over time by
Yeah,
just simply having people with your ideology take over the faculty of a handful of key universities' education departments. So, if you can get hardcore Dewey style progressive education people to dominate the education department of like Columbia University and, Harvard and like a handful of other elite universities, then that becomes like your meta force multiplier. Because then that means that the people who are coming through and getting, master's and PhD degrees in education at the most prestigious and respected universities in the country are getting Dewey's, version of what schooling and education should be. Um, well, they're now the ones, they're not just going to go on to become like your rank and file school teachers. No, no, no. If you're getting an education degree from Columbia University, at worst, you're probably going to end up as a school principal, and probably you're going to end up, much further than that. You might be a professor of education at kind of a mid-tier university down the line. You might end up, being a big wig in some, big city school system or whatever, because after all, you've got the PhD in education from Columbia. And so if you're willing to like, do the force multiplier thing and take your time, like by just taking over the education faculty of a handful of elite universities, then it's just a matter of time until
yeah,
your acolytes dominate the education departments of most universities. And then once you do that for a generation or two, it becomes this self-licking ice cream cone where, once everybody knows, oh yeah, education departments are some of the most, crazy left-wing departments of any university, well then guess what? If you're someone who's got an inclination to be a school teacher just because you like actually helping, young people to learn and stuff, but you're not a progressive, you're a conservative or a libertarian or something else, you're going to self-select out of that. You're going to go, you know what? Why would I go into a profession that, is not going to pay me all that great, where 95% of my colleagues and superiors are going to be like hardcore ideologically opposed to everything I believe. Um, like, do I really want to deal with that for a job that doesn't even, is never going to make me rich if I'm being like
yeah,
a K through 12 teacher or whatever like that. And so, yeah, I mean, people are gonna just self-select out of that. And then yeah, fast forward a generation or two, once you've got, especially like, the teachers that are on track to become administrators and things like that, once they're inculcated into like this one paradigm, and it's so dominant too, where it's like, I'm sure if you're going through a typical let's say, PhD education program today, it's not like you're going to be presented in like a fair way alternative educational paradigms to what we have.
Yes.
It's not like you're going to be sitting there and they're going to be like, all right, great. This week we're going to, I think about when I was an undergraduate, I was going to a small liberal arts college that was still, I don't know if it still is or not, but was at that time still kind of like largely what we think of when we think of like the good old idealistic idea of a liberal arts college, where you're being
Yes.
exposed to a lot of different subjects, you're being taught, some of the classics, you're being exposed to a variety of different ways of viewing the world, and you're being, the civilization is being transmitted to you and whatever. It was sort of old school like that. And I had a lot of really good classes there, but I had a very good world religions class that I took there with an excellent professor. And it was what people, I think, like idealistically think most people think college should be anyway, where the professor teaching this world religions course, he never tried to nudge any student one way or the other on believe this, don't believe this. He tried to present as much as he could within the constraints of time of your covering, dozens of religions in a semester. But he really did do a good job of trying to present the different religions that we covered as like fairly and objectively as possible. Just like here's, their beliefs, their history, this is their metaphysics, they believe that, there's a god and it's like this, and they believe in, these rituals and beliefs are necessary to salvation, or Buddhists believe that this is the path to nirvana or whatever like that. And he presented it like that, and the implication being like, I just want all of you to come out of here having a good, as accurate as we can get it, objective understanding of what different religious groups believe and why they think the way they do. And so, it would be great if you got that with education. If you went in there and they're like, great, now we're going to give you a fair, you know, presentation on what Montessori schooling is, how it operates, the history of it, and then we're going to look at other competing paradigms, the Sudbury model or whatever else there might be. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm sure there's others as well. Just things that are different from our progressive Prussian derived idea of what school should look like and
Yes.
what school should be. It'd be great if you got a whole semester going through like a couple dozen different approaches to what schooling and education should be and should look like. And then at the end of it, it's like, now you get to choose your own adventure as you go out into the world to become a teacher. You get to decide, like, of those things that are out there, like which of them really speaks to you, or do you want to devise your own like new paradigm approach to education, or maybe do the Bruce Lee thing and like put together, oh, I like these pieces of Montessori, I like these pieces of Sudbury, I do like these couple of pieces of the Prussian model, even though I don't like the whole thing or whatever, and like put it together into your own. Like there's none of that. It's just you're being given the Prussian slash Dewey slash progressive
Yeah.
paradigm of education as if it is the only thing there is. And again, it's like you're coming through that program, you're like a fish in water that's only ever been in water. You don't even know that there's other things out there, right? So it just is what is.
Yeah. I've noticed that there are two kinds of teachers. There's the teacher who is really passionate about a subject and wants to teach that subject. That's, you've got a history podcast. Obviously you see it, with the football coach or the baseball coach or the basketball coach, or maybe the math teacher or the science teacher. But then sometimes you'll encounter teachers who just like, I just want to help kids be their best. I
Right.
just want to, and sometimes I wonder, what is your real motivation for becoming a teacher in that sense?
Mhm.
Because that you almost have this, you're going into it because you want to remake the world, so to speak. But
Yeah. A lot of the activist teachers that are now in a lot of the K through 12 systems around the country, the way I look at it is it's like a version of the clergy for progressivism, because I do believe at the end of the day that progressivism is not just a political ideology, it is a religion. Now,
Yes.
it's a religion that has evolved over the years. Like
Yes.
today's progressivism has very little explicit Christianity in it, but Woodrow Wilson's version sure as heck did. John Dewey's version sure as heck did.
Certainly. Yes.
And a lot of those religious elements are still there. They're just no longer like put explicitly in those terms. Um, but they very much have an idea of like sin and original sin and salvation, and even the whole idea of like a teleological endpoint of history is a very Judeo-Christian idea, the idea that there's like a beginning, middle, and end to
Yeah.
things, and so therefore we must have an end of history that we're all marching towards.
Yeah.
um but the to me, when you look at someone, let's say they might even be a very intelligent person who could have been successful at something better if they had chosen to, a bright, young, intelligent person who's going into teaching, knowing that in most places it's not going to make you rich. Now, in some, especially big city places, you can be comfortable, but in a lot of places, it still doesn't pay very well to be like a K through 12 teacher, and so you are foregoing, assuming you're a bright person, like maybe you could have made a lot more money going into something else in the private sector, but
Yeah.
you're choosing to go into education because you are an activist and you see this as a way to spread your activism. To me, that's like the child
Yeah.
of a powerful family back in, I don't know, medieval times. Say you're the second son of a wealthy, powerful family, and you choose to go into the clergy, and it's just another way you can have a respected career. You may not become rich, although if you become the archbishop or something, maybe you will. But like, let's say even people that go into a clergy position that is known to be like not one you'd go into if you just wanted material wealth. Like you go to become, I don't know, a Franciscan monk where you're going to genuinely like help poor people
Yes.
in real life. Well, someone chooses to do that because they believe in it, and they go, "Yeah, I'm a smart guy. I could, take different classes and become a Wall Street, finance person and become rich, but I genuinely believe in the mission of, whatever, the Franciscans, and so I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to consciously choose a career that's not going to make me wealthy because I believe in the cause and I believe in spreading the good word." And I think that's really what you have going on with a lot of the activist types who become, school teachers in K through 12, especially, is that's how they see it. They see it as like, I'm doing something good for humanity.
Yeah.
And they are true believers. And man, a true believer who is a history or political science teacher at a big, high school for 30 years, like how much, there's no way you can measure how much they do or don't influence, the minds of however many thousands of kids come through their classes. Um, who can say?
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, yeah. I think we've probably covered progressive 1.0 enough. When did progressive 1.1.0 end?
I think it kind of breaks down and then sort of reforms into 2.0, around the 1920s, early 1930s.
Okay.
And I think what happens is, and part of this is just sort of like semantics and word games and stuff. So progressives call themselves progressives until maybe like 1920-ish. Um, you're not going to find, you can find a few here and there, but back in like the 19 teens, you're not going to find very many progressives calling themselves liberals. That's going to be very rare. Most people in the first couple decades of the 20th century, if they used the word liberal, they were likely to still mean it in what we now call classical liberalism, of like, the kind of
Yes.
like, Thomas Jefferson through Grover Cleveland paradigm of the Democratic Party, where it's about,
Yes.
small government, limited government, strictly following the Constitution, trying to have, relatively laissez-faire economic policies, keep taxes as low as possible, etc. So by 1920, the American electorate was sick of progressivism. They
Yeah.
had been getting like just slammed with progressive reforms, and then topped off by World War I for 2 decades at that point. You'd had, Teddy Roosevelt, very progressive president in for a while.
Yeah.
Then you had Taft, who was less progressive, but still was progressive by the standards of like Grover Cleveland. Taft was sort of like progressive light and he was only in there 4 years. And then in comes Woodrow Wilson, who's, doubling down on progressivism for 8 years. And so, you had hardcore progressive presidents for close to 16 years, and then progressive light president for another 4 years. And then they had also by 1920, um, had appointed a lot of the Supreme Court justices, and progressivism had really gotten authoritarian during World War One. And so the American people were kind of sick of progressivism by 1920. And it is no coincidence that the guy who won the election, who in some ways is sort of like Trumpian, in some ways, I don't want to overstate the similarities, but Warren Harding. Warren Harding was
Yeah.
very much like an outsider, sort of populist, anti-establishment guy in a lot of ways. And Warren Harding, his main campaign slogan and theme in 1920 was a return to normalcy.
Yeah.
And really what he meant by that, and the American people understood this, it wasn't that subtle of a dog whistle. What he meant by a return to normalcy was like, hey, aren't you sick of like all the nonstop progressive, taking over of the economy, getting us into World War One, drafting you to go fight in that war, squashing your free speech at home during the war, having the government just take over the economy and like tax you to the brink and whatever. Aren't you tired of that? Vote for me. And I'm
Yeah.
the anti all of that. And running as the anti-progressive guy, Warren Harding won a pretty decent landslide in 1920. Now, progressives didn't just say, like, well, we believe in democracy and the voters clearly don't want progressivism, so we're just going to stop trying to sell it. No. Instead, they just rebrand it. And so it's actually John Dewey is one of the first people to sort of start the movement within progressive intellectual circles of let's stop using the P word so much. Let's steal the word liberal for what we want to do. And so they're still pushing most of the same stuff. It's just now it's no longer called progressive, it's now called liberal. Now it's the opposite of what liberalism meant for like 2 centuries of Western civilization before then. But let's just go ahead and steal their word anyway and make some sort of convoluted argument that says, oh yeah, in the 1800s, the liberal thing was to be for limited constitutional government because that was the progressive kind of force of that time. But now that we're in a new century and new, historical conditions and whatever, now the progressive thing to be in favor of historical progress is to be in favor of more government, as long as it's the right kind of government, control of society and the economy, this elitist idea of progressive
Yeah.
technocracy. And so John Dewey and a few others sort of start this movement of like, let's start calling ourselves liberals. And so by the time you get Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s is when the usage of the word progressive by progressives becomes very rare, and the word liberal becomes the more common word. Now, there also were changes as well in terms of the approach. FDR's version of progressivism, version 2.0,
Yeah.
when it starts to be called liberalism in a lot of cases, it's a little different from Woodrow Wilson's version. There's less of a religious tinge to it. Again, not to say that the religiosity drops out, but that it sort of
Yeah.
fades into more subtle ways. There's less explicit talk of we're giving you social security because we want to create a kingdom of God on earth and that sort of talk. There's less
Yeah.
of that. There's the issues of the day have changed somewhat. People are no longer losing their minds over railroad regulation because the railroads are fading in terms of their importance. The national bank is no longer an issue because that's a done deal that got passed under Wilson. So it's version 2.0 is like the New Deal, is really what it is.
Yeah.
So there's obviously still a lot of continuity and similarities to version 1.0, but there's also different changes in content and emphases and issues.
And
Um, and version 2.0, there's less eugenics, at least explicitly, as part of it. There's less the, uh, you know, prohibitionism of alcohol is no longer part of the progressive, kind of movement as much, although it gets replaced almost instantly by the war on drugs, which really gets rolling in a big way in the 1930s.
yeah,
Um,
the Reefer Madness movie. Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like, The timing is not a coincidence, but right as the government is finally like, all right, you know what, we're going to give up on trying to ban alcohol. They're like,
Well,
but man, do we need to do something about the marijuana?
you had people lost their jobs too. This
Mhm.
was people who lost their jobs and were looking for a new job, FDR also recognized the Soviet Union. I don't know if there was, because there was very much an attitude toward the Soviet Union and people who were issuing a lot of apologetics for it. I think and although I don't think it gets talked about much, they were actually much more sympathetic even to Hitler and Mussolini than they'd like to admit.
Oh yeah, in the very early days of Hitler and Mussolini, yeah. Um, you can find quotes of many leading progressives saying good things about Mussolini, especially, and to a lesser extent Hitler, especially early on.
Yeah.
Before those regimes started really, starting a lot of wars and started really cracking down hard internally. But they definitely like they admired you. You can find even some passages from John Maynard Keynes where he's saying nice stuff about fascist regimes, and he's saying it from like a technocracy point of view, where he's like, oh man, in the US and UK and countries like that have democracy, it's this messy chaotic thing where we have all these brilliant economists like me who know how the economy
Yes.
should be run, but we're not able to just work our magic, without constraints. We have to like, worry about, will we politically be empowered to do this? And we got to care about, how the stupid voters vote and whatever. But man, look at, in a place like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany, yeah, man, they can just appoint experts to run things and like that's it. There's no dealing with the messiness of checks and balances and annoying constitutional restraints and having to deal with getting enough votes in Congress to set up your program or whatever it is. No, you can just have like this, empowered, benevolent despotism, where your
Yeah.
enlightened despot can just decide that, like, nope, I'm the expert. I know how the economy should be run, and this is it. So this is what we're doing. Yeah, and you can certainly detect it's not very latent at all. You can certainly detect envy in the words of somebody like John Maynard Keynes when he's talking about the ways that a government like Mussolini's fascist government in Italy, for example, can just play God with their economy. Um, he's jealous because he'd love to be able to do that in his country.
Well, and then you had somebody like Walter Duranty at the New York Times who just completely covered up all the things that Stalin was doing.
Yeah,
One thing I
yeah,
should have asked too is I know also, during all this time, there was also, what we would call civil service reform,
yep.
which, you go back to, what they called the spoils system, I win the election, I fire all the old people, and then I replace them with my own hacks. And then afterwards, it's decided now we've got to do what we can to protect civil service. I mean, I suppose that evolved over time, but we're getting to a point where it's getting harder and harder to fire people who work for the government.
Yeah, and that was an early win for American progressives, like really kind of before progressivism was even fully a thing. Um, the civil service movement goes back to like 1870s and 80s, and the argument seems to, make sense where it's like, look, isn't it a problem, let's say that, every time there's a change of political party in charge, the entire let's just pick one example. The entire, postal service, top to bottom, gets completely replaced, and it's not just that you're replacing the handful of people at the top that run it, like what we have now, but, like, no, 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 like, literally everybody, top to bottom, is liable to get replaced by new people, which might cause, like, a lot of disconnect and instability and whatever within the organization, make it, problematic to keep it running smoothly, and keep continuity going. But also, yeah, the tendency, of course, was that, if I'm the new incoming president and I'm going to replace everybody at the postal department top to bottom, yeah, I'm going to do that based on political patronage. I'm going to do it on like, oh, I've got all these people that, did me favors to help me get elected. Like, yeah, now they're going to get a cushy government job. And it might even be a BS one where they don't hardly have to do anything and they just, get a government check as a thank you for helping me get elected president. And isn't that a problem? It's a form of corruption, and isn't it also a problem that people are getting, maybe even kind of, not even so much low flunky level jobs, but like people with positions of authority in Department X who have no. It would be like if Hunter Biden got made the Secretary of Energy. Even something he's even less qualified for than being part of a Ukrainian energy company, right? Where it's like, yeah, this guy has absolutely nothing in terms of his background, his education, his prior career experience. He has nothing that gives him any knowledge whatsoever about energy. And yet now he's getting this job just because he's, politically connected and someone owes him a favor. Isn't this a problem? Wouldn't it be better if we had experts in energy, let's say running the energy department, or if we had experienced experts running the postal service instead of political, flunkies? And it's like, on the one hand, that argument makes sense, but then the flip side is the alternative is you create what we have, which is, this idea of career civil service bureaucrats, where the vast majority of the people that work at a government department are there permanent career sort of a basis. They don't get to get, replaced at will by a new government coming in. And so then you end up in the situation where you have a permanent administrative state where
Yeah.
the election results don't matter. 98% of the people that comprise what we call the Department of Defense are going to be the same people that were there before the election as after. And the same thing applies to every other department. And this is a problem for a variety of reasons, especially when you combine it with the existence of the open door, or I should say, the revolving door, where people will often, over the course of their career, bop back and forth between, the private sector and then the part of the government that is, supposed to be regulating their sector of the private economy. Someone who works at Monsanto for a while, then goes and works at the Department of Agriculture, then comes back and works at ConAgra for a while, and then goes back to the Department of Agriculture. And each time they're a little bit higher up as they tack back and forth. Um, and
Yeah.
then this becomes especially problematic once you have things like intelligence agencies, which are really where the administrative state turns into the deep state, which is, you have these parts of the government where most of the people in it are career, they can't be fired, they don't care about what, happens to an election or whatever, because they're going to still have their job regardless. They're almost impossible to fire unless they do something just like grossly illegal or unethical, like, felony or something. Um, and so this means that, for example, the American people can elect a president who is hardcore anti-war, and he comes in, but, and maybe he replaces some people at the top of the Defense Department and the State Department or whatever. And yeah, he can replace some of the people at the top of the CIA, but most of the bulk of the institution is the same people. And so the people can elect an anti-war president, for example, but people who are the permanent behind the scenes, especially if they're in the intelligence world where they have all these,
Yeah.
powers of secrecy and, things like rigging elections and overthrowing leaders and manipulating public opinion is sort of like what they do. Um, they can figure out a way to manipulate you. They can figure out a way, if you're the president and you're not going along with their plan to start World War III, they can figure out a way to manipulate you into supporting World War III. And if not, they can figure out a way to, replace you with somebody who can. So yeah, something that sounds very like no duh, makes sense, and like who could be opposed to it, like civil service reform, it leads you down the road towards bureaucratic tyranny and the deep state, where elections don't really matter that much.
Yeah. And, I have to share this quote from FDR himself, quote, this is a letter. Quote, all government employees should realize that the process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service.
Hmm.
It has its distinct and insurmountable limitations when applied to public personnel management, unquote. So there you have it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not think that government employees should unionize. And I believe it was Wisconsin in the 50s was the first state that said, oh, government employees can unionize. And that opened up in it a huge can of worms.
Yeah, and I think there's a good case to be made that for a while now, the most powerful unions in the country are the public sector unions, not the private sector unions. Like the the Teamsters or the United Auto Workers or whoever else like that. Um, they're not the force that they
Yes.
used to be. Um, Whereas like the teachers union,
Yes.
is much more powerful in a lot of
Yes.
ways. And yeah, and it's a problem. And it's funny. Yeah, I've seen that quote before too, where you realize like, no, FDR actually, he had some valid thoughts about certain
Yeah.
things. Like he was at the end of the day, and I think this is one of the things that differentiates progressivism 2.0 from 1.0,
Yeah.
is that progressivism 2.0 is more pragmatic, which in some ways makes it like less bad than
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson's version of progressivism because his was very moralistic. um, FDR is a very pragmatic guy rather than being a dogmatic
Yes.
ideologue like Woodrow Wilson. And so yeah, he has more possibility to occasionally be right about something than Woodrow Wilson is because he's coming at it from more of just a, like what makes sense and what seems like it would work. And so he's able to realize like, oh yeah, if you have unions in the government sector, it creates this,
Yeah.
crazy situation of perverse incentives that allow them to sort of like hold everybody hostage in a way that private sector unions really couldn't.
And as much as people talk about, oh, January 6th, 2021, one of the worst cases of, occupying a government building was when they occupied the government buildings in Wisconsin, and it was all these employees who were just saying, demanding this and that. And and Milei has been dealing with that right now down in Argentina. Government employees wanted to occupy the buildings. I mean, and my brother was a mailman, and they were legally not allowed to run for federal office. I
Hmm,
jokingly suggested to Michael, "Why don't you run for Congress?" He said, "I'd have to quit my job."
hmm.
And yet, you have all these teachers and other people who will run for the state legislature or whatever, and it's a huge conflict of interest. And uh, yeah, that's another thing, too, is just having government employees run for the state legislature or stuff like that. It's you know,
Yeah, yeah. And how about people who just finished working at, a place like the CIA for a decade or two,
yes,
getting elected to Congress. Like, am I the only person that thinks that this is crazy and that this is like another example of they're not even trying to keep up appearances anymore? Um, where like you really think that someone who just spent a decade or two working at the CIA, who now is elected to a seat in Congress, that like they've just closed the book on that chapter of their
yeah,
life working for CIA all those years? Like really? And do you also believe that when Dick Cheney became vice president, like he was no longer at all doing what was best for
yeah.
Halliburton? Like that he was able to just compartmentalize that off? Yeah, I mean CIA is one of those things. It's like the mafia. You never really unjoin it, once you've been in it. So yeah, it's disturbing, and it is interesting. As far as I know, still it's the case that, um, as far as I know, that unions are the only sort of tax exempt organization that is given a free pass to engage in politics.
Oh,
Like
wow.
I know that churches will
Churches can't
do
do
it,
that. Yes,
but they're not
think tanks,
supposed to.
things
They
can't,
they
think tanks can't do it. Yeah, that's very interesting. Oh, and by the way, CJ, if you haven't read it, look up a book called by Samuel Blumenfeld. It's called NEA Trojan Horse in American Education. Although it is
Okay.
about 40 years old, that's a book that's worth reading. He is somewhat religious, but that's still very interesting, because that
Okay,
is,
yeah,
that is the largest government union in the country is the NEA.
yeah.
Yeah, the misnamed National Education Association. But so
Yeah,
this is
yeah, I've
yeah,
I've not I've not read that book by him. I've read another one, I think it
yeah,
was Is Public Education Necessary? Something like that is the title.
yeah.
But I haven't read
You
that one
know,
on the NEA.
this is interesting. We've gone to progressivism 2.0, which got us into World War II and really but really it permanently enshrined the interventionist state that Wilson wanted to build.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, not to mention, I wish I could remember the exact place, but I know it was in U.S. News and World Report. and it actually said we got more permanent bureaucracies from World War II than we did from the New Deal.
Oh yeah. I would definitely believe that. Um, and just in general, like, in Crisis and Leviathan terms, right, that whole, idea, from Robert Higgs that, the government grows not in a slow and steady way, but in like fits and starts with occasional, temporary setbacks in its growth. And that it always tends to grow the most, during crises, especially war.
Yes.
And there's charts you can look at of like, US federal spending as a percentage of the nation's GDP, over time. And you see when you get to the 1930s and the New Deal, there is a pretty significant spike in the overall footprint of government during the New Deal years. However, it is less than the spike that you see for World War One, let alone the spike that you see for World War Two. And so, World War One actually had more government growth
Yes.
occurring during it than the New Deal, and World War Two dwarfs that. So I used to, try to red pill some of my conservative students because when I was teaching, I was at a college, at a fairly small town in a fairly rural, very, red county in North Florida. And so, my students were mostly, if they were anything, right wingers.
Yeah.
And I used to try to red pill them a little bit and say, like, look, you'll hear conservatives today often, oh, I'm all against the New Deal because the New Deal was big government going crazy. And isn't that bad? And I'd say, okay, yeah. And I agree. Like, if you're a conservative or a libertarian, you probably should be against the New Deal. However, if the
Yeah.
reason you're against the New Deal is because it represents a drastic growth in the size and power of government, I got news for you. You should be more opposed to World War II even than you are to the New Deal because that big government that you claim to be so opposed to, the growth of, it grew way more during World War II than it did during the New Deal years of the 1930s, like
Yeah.
way more. And so if you're just against big government, you need to be hardcore, like retroactively peacenik for World War II. And certainly you ought to be a peacenik for the next war because that's going to be the next time that they, make the most dramatic power grabs.
And let's also point out that to their credit, the 20s were the last time really that the red team did any significant cuts in the government.
Yep.
There were some significant cuts there, and really we haven't. It seems like something happened, to American conservatism that made it just completely worthless after this, although it was dying. But conservatism never really was. I think conservatism was always somewhat pro corporate welfare, and so they were never really that. They were always lukewarm to true capitalism. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I think you're right that
yeah,
no kind of like version of American conservatism has ever been like consistent, doctrinaire free market across the board. There's often, a strong protectionist streak amongst conservatives. And but yeah, it's really like in the 50s, I would say, where, and I actually believe that the CIA itself was behind a lot of this,
yeah.
where, spearheaded by CIA and Yale Skull and Bones alumnus William F. Buckley Jr.,
Oh God,
where conservatism gets hijacked, where, if you look at conservatism in the 1930s and 40s, it was not perfectly libertarian across the board, but it was
yeah.
pretty good. The sort of like old right of a lot of, like Garrett Garrett and, those sorts of people, H.L. Mencken.
John T.
Um,
Flynn.
yeah, there's another good one. A lot of those guys, they were pretty good by libertarian standards. They weren't, 100%
Yeah,
across the board, but they were pretty solid. Generally opposed to big government at home and opposed to intervention abroad. And so, Buckley and what he represented to me is like an astroturf redirection of the conservative impulse. And it's another case of like, diverting a populist impulse in order to tame it and make it not a threat to the establishment. So if you can um change what it means to be a conservative from what it meant like John T. Flynn style to now, if you're a conservative, more than anything else, you're defined by wanting a giant military and being very aggressive in foreign
yeah,
policy. That's really the most important thing that defines whether you're conservative or not. And yeah, you have these other values like, oh, you'd like to have lower taxes and like to have a little bit less government control of the economy or whatever. But your biggest value is hawk on foreign policy. Well, then when push comes to shove and there's a conflict between those two values, and it's like, okay, um, I can maybe get a cut in the welfare state, but it's going to require me agreeing to also cut the warfare state, make a deal with some anti-militarist left wingers to do this. Um, it's like you're you're not going to be able to sacrifice if the greater value in your mind is the warfare state. You're going to be willing to sacrifice your desire to have the welfare state rolled back in order to keep the warfare state growing, if that makes sense. I know I kind of
Yeah.
jumbled it a little bit there in a word salad, but hopefully it wasn't as bad as a common word salad.
Not to and not to mention, I think there was also this realization that war can be a business, uh,
Hmm.
and so we'll make it a permanent war economy because we've now established this permanent enemy that because certainly Buckley was it was defined by hatred of the Soviet Union. Of course, many of the early many of these early people were Trotskyites, so they hated Stalin, but it's just went from there. But this was after Progressive 2.0 got us into the war, uh, and Buckley really was purging true people who really did believe in the free market. Was kicking out people like the John Birch Society, which I think truly was populist, and then later, just completely, he absolutely hated Ayn Rand, who emerged on the
Hmm.
scene in the 40s and 50s as well.
Hmm.
So it looks like about maybe around with Roosevelt's death, that was the end of progressivism 2.0. I mean,
I mean, you could argue that it kind of lingers around through the 40s and 50s, and it's sort of bipartisan too. Like when you look at the differences, say, between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower on domestic policies are subtle. Like
yes,
Eisenhower's not trying to dismantle Social
yes,
Security um, or to roll it. Like, yeah, he's making some marginal, rollbacks here and there, but you know, it was sort of a bipartisan consensus in a lot of ways on progressivism 2.0. But 3.0, I would say, is sort of like the Lyndon Johnson Great Society version. And again, it's not like it's a total divergence from the
yeah,
previous version. It's just like a slight redirection a little bit here and there, a change in emphases. One of the big changes I would say from 2.0 to 3.0 is um well, we can go all the way back to 1.0. 1.0 progressivism was basically explicitly racist,
yes,
and largely like WASP white supremacist, really, when you dig into it. 2.0 is often still racist in its like effects, but it's not explicitly racist in terms of like its rhetoric and its marketing. So like, Franklin
yeah,
Roosevelt, so a lot of his New Deal policies like did hurt the black population in various ways. But then, other New Deal programs did help the black population in various
yeah,
ways too. So it's kind of a wash. And FDR was the first black president to get a majority, or sorry, FDR was the first Democrat president to get a majority of the black vote.
yes,
Um, and so, you know, progressivism had evolved enough that it was no longer alienating um, the black population. But FDR still had to make a lot of deals with a lot of racist Southern progressives to get a lot of his
yes,
programs passed, and so there still was a fair amount of racist things baked into New Deal progressivism, even if they were not always explicit. But then with LBJ and the Great Society is when you get it starting to be explicitly the other way, where you know now not only are we no longer going to try and say that black people are inferior and we're going to try to keep them down, but now in the name of uplifting them, we're going to have more and more welfare state programs that are explicitly like targeted at them in order to help them. Again, this elitist paternalist idea. It's not like we're going to go in there and ask them what they want. We're going to come in as do-gooder, progressive, elitist reformers and foist reforms on them, whether they ask for them or not. But that becomes a bigger. So progressivism 3.0 is when you get like welfare in the form of programs where you can just sort of like exist and have kids and get a check.
yes.
That was not a feature. FDR's progressivism still had like a work ethic to it, where
Yes.
yeah, we're going to have the TVA and it's a government program to give you money, but like you're going to have to actually go out there and labor. You're not just going to get a check for showing up and existing. And the
Well,
other
yeah,
thing, the other thing too is that a lot of the progressive social welfare programs of the FDR era, they were still socially conservative, by which I mean there were often things built into the programs that were designed to do things like incentivize marriage and incentivize family staying intact and try and enable it for even a guy of fairly humble station in life to be the sole breadwinner for his family. um a lot, whether it worked out or not, a lot of the New Deal programs were like that sort of, number one, you're still going to have to work to get government assistance. And number two, we're going to try at least to structure the programs to incentivize traditional families to exist and stay together. Whereas it's in 3.0 with the Great Society where that goes out the window. And now it's just like, nope. If you're, a poor woman who has kids, the more kids you have, the bigger a check you'll get, and that just incentivizes you to not get married. Like, why deal with getting married and having to negotiate something as annoying as a marriage if you can just, have baby daddies who occasionally knock you up and give you another government check in the mail, so to speak.
yeah,
And so, yeah, but it's still, not fully the woke madness, in
yeah,
the Great Society version of it's like anti-racist, but like moderately anti-racist, I suppose maybe you
yeah,
could put it. It's not crazy
yeah,
wokeism yet, but you still get
yeah.
like the early versions of affirmative action and stuff like that.
Well, I think too. I think Dr. King probably when he said content of their character, I think he was really sincere about that. But, also, you've got the promotion of the promotion of the the divorce culture, and I would also have to throw in the pill,
Yep.
which wasn't done by the government, but these were things that changed, and I also I forgot to mention, one of the big changes in the blue team that happened, after Roosevelt got elected the first time was they scrapped the 2/3 rule.
Mm. Yeah.
You had to get the 1924 convention, for example, went to 103 ballots because the nominee had to get 2/3 of the convention body, and so I think that probably gave a veto to maybe the more conservative elements within the blue team. And then once it was just a simple majority, maybe that is what got the train sped up, and of course, going back to civil rights, we can certainly talk about how Truman was actually, the man who desegregated the troops, and
Mhm.
which was certainly a positive thing. And the end of Jim Crow, I think, was overall a positive thing. Although
Oh, yeah.
now we've gotten into this mode though, where everybody's a racist, and I would also, just call it the growth of victim politics.
Sure.
Yeah, second wave feminism was a part of that. Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to cover that as much because I think we know more about this,
Mm.
but this was also a time when we saw a growth in overall college attendance.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I know one guy said, between 65 and 75, the number of professors doubled, and he said this was where a lot of woke stuff came in because they
Mhm.
had to go out and hire these people, lowered their standards. I mean, I don't know, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean that's probably a factor in that evolution. There's also the fact that everybody from the CIA to a lot of the big corporate foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, they started to get more and more into sort of like the proto versions of wokeism. They, for example, sponsored the famous Frankfurt School in a lot of ways. Um, a lot of people don't know that like the CIA, they were they were pushing um, non-communist left-wing organizations and causes throughout the Cold War. And so they saw something like the Frankfurt School, which is one of the seeds of wokeism. It's not the only seed, but one of the seeds of wokeism. They saw the Frankfurt School of these whatever you want to call them, like post Marxists or Marxist revisionists. They saw them as useful because they were critical of the Soviet Union in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And so they started like signal boosting and amplifying and sponsoring those sorts of intellectuals, subsidizing their publications, helping them with their careers and whatever. And these are the people who, like, their ideology over time evolves towards wokeism. Now there's other ingredients and things that come into play to form what we think of as like today's wokeista cult. But yeah, a lot of it was started off as like these you know anti-Soviet but still hard left intellectuals that the CIA started sponsoring for their own cynical
Yeah.
purposes. That then, like everything else we've been talking about, it's like once they take over a profession, then it becomes a self-perpetuating,
Yeah.
ideological ice cream cone.
And we also talked, about these various professional organizations like the American Medical Association, which has never really been in favor of free markets in medicine,
Oh
and
yeah.
they've often been, going after, alternative medicine and stuff like that. And some of it is baloney, but some of it is actually, they've always wanted a highly regulated medical care. But, it was also during, the 60s that we got, a stethoscope, which was one of the big medical drug regulations. And we, of course, got Medicare and Medicaid and all this stuff. And the government got into the healthcare business, which was a disaster.
Sure.
Yeah. Uh, also, I think that was, what it almost seems like, CJ, is we did all these degenerate academics from 1920s Germany come to America after the war? Is that what happened? I mean, the Frankfurt School, the Herbert Marcuse,
Yep.
and some of these other people. One of the first institute for the study of transgenderism was in Germany in the 1920s, and that was,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Germany.
yeah. And yeah, a lot of those people, whether they were actually brought to the US or whether they stayed in Europe but were just sort of like, subsidized and sponsored and helped or whatever. Yeah, they were seen by a lot of people, a lot of the oligarchs and their immediate henchmen who were,
Yeah,
running the CIA and running the corporate foundations. They saw people like the Frankfurt School intellectuals as useful. They saw it as, look, these are people who are going to like attack the Soviet Union. Maybe not for the reasons an American right winger would attack the Soviet Union rhetorically, but that anybody who's criticizing the Soviet Union, especially if they're doing it from the left, is useful in the Cold War. And so, the Soviet government, in a lot of ways, was culturally pretty conservative. Like the Soviet government wasn't in most cases like trying to totally deconstruct family and gender roles or whatever. Now they wanted the state to come in and be like the big brother, over everything and whatever like that. But like, the Soviet Union and a lot of other communist governments in the 20th century famously, like they would imprison and even execute people for being homosexual, and like they were very culturally reactionary in a lot of ways.
yeah,
And so, the kind of early proto wokies were seen as like, oh, this is a way to attack them. Have people basically
yeah,
saying, oh, look at these totalitarian, oppressive regimes. Why they want to persecute you just for being gay, or they want to persecute you for, listening to degenerate Western rock music and wearing blue jeans and whatever. Um, aren't isn't the Soviet regime bad? Wouldn't you rather listen to these, more libertine, left wing voices, that sort of
yes,
thing? And you could see it too in things like what I discussed last time I was on Tom Woods the other day. Things like that it's different but related, where the CIA was boosting modern art. They were boosting people like Jackson Pollock and whatever, just because it was a counter to Soviet art. Soviet art was often very stylized and obviously very propagandistic, but it was also representational. Like if you had a drawing of a heroic soldier, it was a drawing of a heroic soldier. It wasn't like blobs of paint on a canvas and you're supposed to, think this is a profound abstract thing. And so, the CIA was sponsoring people like Jackson Pollock basically so that they could create this Emperor's New Clothes situation of like, hey, look, we've got these truly creative avant-garde artists over
yeah,
here in the free West. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, their art is all like heavily state controlled. Their pictures actually are of the things that they look like. Isn't that
yeah.
oppressive? And so, yeah, weirdly, they end up, sponsoring all of this like cultural deconstructionism and things like that. Um, I think just by thinking short term, really, I think they
Yeah,
started off, um, just thinking like what's going to, earn us propaganda points against the Soviets today,
yeah,
rather than where does this go in like 5 generations of this stuff? Where does it go as far as cultural degeneration?
yeah. And I've heard the CIA and even the OSS before that were involved in the promotion of various so-called works of art. I mean, I read this
Mm,
article about Hemingway, and I was attracted to it because I've always hated Ernest Hemingway, but just how he was promoted by the OSS or the CIA, and how they
mm,
promoted all these myths about him to make him be considered great literature. And I have to admit, CJ, when I first learned about Ayn Rand, I had this attitude. Well, if all of these literature professors hate Ayn Rand so much, she's got to be pretty good.
mm,
I don't know if you've read Ayn Rand, but that's
mm,
that was definitely something that got me, because it also seems like you end up with this art that gets more progressive. Not to mention, you look at things like the publishing industry. This is also a very highly credentialed industry where you take a lot of the executives at Random House or Macmillan or whatever are these people who got all these fancy degrees at the big Ivy League schools. So
mm.
that's an industry that's almost, I would say, definitely left wing, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, and I am up against the clock now. I do have to
yeah,
have
yeah.
to
I understand. Well, this has
finish
been a great
representing.
conversation. I should probably bring you back soon. But I wanted to go into 1.0 the most because I feel like I know a lot more. But you had some good stuff here. It's maybe I'll bring you back in a while. But
Okay.
well, where can we find you out there, CJ?
Dangeroushistorypodcast.com takes you to my
Yeah,
website, or you can just go on whatever app, podcatcher platform that you like to listen to your audio
yeah,
podcasts on and put in Dangerous History Podcast, and you should
yeah,
look it up.
yeah. So please like my novel, subscribe to or please buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Subscribe to this channel, like the video, thumbs up. Also, check out my Substack, and also go to buy me a copy to Pro. Also, CJ, if you haven't checked it out, check out Rudyard Lynch's What If Alt His channel. I've had him here on twice. He's a
Huh.
great kid.
Okay.
Uh, he started doing it when he was a teenager. He's not a kid. He's in his 20s. But yeah, if you get a chance, there's some good hit.
Okay.
We could talk about some good history stuff out there too, because there is some amazing history stuff out there now. But yeah, well, it's been great having you on here, CJ. I'm Chris Baker. We're out.